1943. The world burns in the fires of war. Across the shattered cities of Europe and the scorched deserts of Africa, Axis soldiers march under a darkening sky, convinced their nations command the greatest power on earth. They had seen tanks, heard engines roar, and watched factories hum with the rhythm of total war. But when they fell into American hands, something changed. Under the rising sun of a foreign land, the United States, they saw something they were never meant to see: a civilization fueled not by conquest, but by creation. Endless convoys of trucks thundered across vast highways. Steel mills breathed fire night and day. Ships rolled off the docks in numbers too staggering to count. In every direction, machines moved like living giants, working tirelessly, endlessly. A mechanical heartbeat that powered the Allied world. Axis prisoners, once proud and certain of their superiority, found themselves standing in stunned silence. They watched ordinary American workers, men, women, even teenagers, command an industrial symphony so vast that it dwarfed every army, every general, every dream of empire they had ever known. In that moment, behind the barbed wire of POW camps and the fences of factory tours, many of them realized the war had already been decided, not by the battlefield, but by the machine. When the Axis prisoners arrived on American soil, it was as though they had stepped into another world, one that defied every expectation, every illusion they had carried across oceans and battlefields. The journey itself had been long and humbling. From the smoke-choked ruins of Tunisia and Sicily, they had been herded aboard ships that smelled of salt, steel, and surrender. For weeks, they crossed the Atlantic under armed watch, unsure of what awaited them. Rumors spread among them. Some whispered that America was still a land of cowboys and deserts. Others imagined skyscrapers and neon lights. But nothing, not even their wildest guesses, could prepare them for what they were about to witness. When the ships finally reached the American coast, the prisoners crowded against the railings, eyes squinting through the mist of morning. The first thing they saw were the docks, massive structures of concrete and steel, stretching so far that they seemed to merge with the horizon. Towering cranes moved with mechanical precision, unloading cargo with rhythmic ease. Cargo ships came and went like clockwork, their hulls gleaming, their decks crowded with crates stamped "Made in USA." The POWs watched in silence, many of them too stunned to speak. For men who had once believed in the superiority of German engineering or the industrial discipline of Italy and Japan, it was an unsettling revelation. America's strength wasn't just vast, it was alive. As they disembarked under guard, trains were already waiting. Not one or two, but dozens, lined up like metal serpents, their engines churning clouds of steam that hung in the cold air. Every train was loaded with something. Trucks, crates, spare parts, fuel drums, and endless supplies. The prisoners stepped onto the platforms, their boots clanging on the iron steps, and felt dwarfed by the scale of it all. These weren't the rickety, wartime rail cars of Europe. These were monsters of motion, sleek and powerful, built to haul entire armies across continents. Even the air smelled different, of oil, smoke, and a kind of restless energy that made everything seem possible. As the trains began to move inland, the POWs pressed their faces to the glass, and what they saw left them speechless. Mile after mile, the land rolled by, green fields, thriving towns, and then rising from the distance, the industrial heart of America. It was a world of noise and fire. Massive steel mills belched flame into the sky, glowing like volcanoes in the night. Endless conveyors carried molten metal that poured like rivers of light. The ground trembled with the rhythm of machinery. Every few miles they passed new factories, some building trucks, others producing munitions, aircraft parts, or uniforms. Even the smallest towns had workshops, their chimneys puffing smoke like signal fires in a kingdom of industry. For the prisoners, it was more than impressive, it was incomprehensible. In their homelands, industry had been a matter of survival. Here, it was a way of life. The Americans didn't just manufacture, they multiplied. Where Germany had rationed steel and struggled to repair bombed plants, the US built new ones overnight. Where Italy's resources had withered under blockade, America's trains carried coal and iron across thousands of miles without pause. Everything worked, everything connected. It was as if the entire nation had turned itself into one great machine, and every man, woman, and child was a cog spinning in perfect time. At one camp in the Midwest, the POWs were allowed to step off the train for inspection. The camp itself was neat and astonishingly well built. Wooden barracks, gravel paths, mess halls, and watchtowers that seemed more organized than threatening. Beyond the fences, they could see the silhouettes of factories rising against the horizon. The guards spoke casually, even kindly. There was no rage, no cruelty. The Axis soldiers were issued clean clothes, simple meals and blankets, things they hadn't seen in months. One of them, a young German mechanic named Ernst, whispered to his companion, "This doesn't feel like war. It feels like order." Days later, when they were taken on work detail near a local plant, their astonishment deepened. The plant stretched across acres, its buildings connected by rail lines, its interior lit by thousands of lamps. Inside, machines thundered like titans. Conveyor belts moved at dizzying speed, carrying parts from one station to another. Men in hard hats shouted over the noise, while foremen guided the rhythm like conductors of an orchestra. The prisoners had never seen such precision, not even in the famed Krupp works of Germany. Ernst stood by a massive stamping press that could flatten a steel sheet in seconds. He watched as it descended with a thunderous boom, then rose again, leaving behind a perfectly formed plate for a Sherman tank. He felt the vibration in his bones. Next to him, an American worker noticed his expression and grinned. First time seeing a real press, ha! He shouted over the noise. Ernst nodded mutely. The worker laughed, slapped the side of the machine, and said, "We've got 100 more like it just in this county." That night, back at the camp, the prisoners couldn't stop talking. Each man described something different. The endless supply trucks, the lines of welders, the women assembling engines faster than any soldier could reload a rifle. They argued, debated, even joked about how they had underestimated their enemy. But beneath the laughter was something else, a quiet, unspoken fear. They had believed the war could still be won by courage and tactics. Now they realized it might already be lost to numbers and steel. Every day brought new proof. They saw rivers of coal being unloaded by cranes that never stopped. They saw locomotives hauling tanks, planes, and artillery in an endless stream. They saw highways full of military vehicles, all brand new, all moving with purpose, and everywhere the same rhythm, the hum of industry that never slept. Even when the sun went down, America did not rest. From their barracks, the POWs could see the glow of factories burning through the night like a second sunrise. The sound of machinery carried on the wind, a constant heartbeat that reminded them of the power that surrounded them. The guards called it the swing shift. To the prisoners, it sounded like the march of an invisible army. One day, while working in a loading yard, a group of Italian prisoners watched as a new train arrived. Flat cars loaded with freshly assembled jeeps and half-tracks gleamed under the afternoon sun. One of the Italians, a former engineer named Paolo, muttered, "How do they build so much so fast?" A guard overheard him and shrugged. "We don't build just for us," he said. "We build for the world." That idea, for the world, stuck with them. They began to understand that America's power wasn't born only from technology or wealth, but from purpose. Every bolt, every crate, every bullet had meaning. They saw unity in motion. Farmers growing food for soldiers, rail workers shipping steel to factories, housewives collecting scrap metal for recycling drives. No one was idle. No one complained. It was as if the whole nation had agreed to fight in a single, unbroken rhythm. The Axis prisoners had been taught that democracy was weak, that freedom made people soft. But what they saw contradicted everything. Here, freedom had become fuel. The workers didn't labor out of fear. They worked out of belief. It was a power that couldn't be ordered or forced, only shared. For the first time, the prisoners began to grasp the scale of what they faced. Not just an enemy, but an idea. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the factory's noise faded to a distant hum, some of them lay awake, staring at the barrack ceiling. They thought of home, the blacked-out cities of Europe, the hunger, the shortages, the cold winters without fuel. And then they thought of what they had seen here: light, warmth, abundance. It was humbling. For many, it was the beginning of an awakening. Weeks turned to months, and the wonder never faded. Every new sight brought another revelation: an airfield filled with B-17 bombers, each gleaming like silver giants, a shipyard where destroyers slid into the sea one after another, faster than the Axis could sink them, a convoy of trucks loaded with food, medical supplies, and ammunition that seemed to stretch to the edge of the earth. To men who had lived through scarcity, it felt like witnessing magic. But it wasn't magic, it was discipline, coordination, and willpower. And in their hearts, many of them felt a reluctant admiration. They could no longer pretend that the propaganda of their leaders had told them the truth. America was not decadent, not disorganized, not weak. It was a nation of builders, relentless, tireless, and united by something far stronger than fear. By the time winter came, even the sound of the machines had become familiar, a constant reminder that the world they once believed unshakable was crumbling, and another, greater one was rising before their eyes. The POWs didn't just see America's power. They felt it, breathed it, lived it every day behind the fences. And though they were captives in a strange way, they were also witnesses to something vast and unstoppable, the heartbeat of a nation that would reshape the world. They came to realize, slowly and almost unwillingly, that the true soldiers of America did not wear uniforms at all. The Axis POWs had entered the war believing in armies, divisions, battalions, the thunder of tanks and artillery. But as they settled into the rhythm of camp life and began to work alongside civilians, they discovered that the heart of America's power beat not in the battlefield, but in its factories. Here, the front lines were drawn in steel and sweat. The battlefield was a production floor that never slept, and its warriors were ordinary people. Mothers, daughters, mechanics, farmers, machinists, each fighting their own quiet war with a wrench instead of a rifle. It began the first morning they were taken to work detail at the nearby assembly plant. The guards lined them up before sunrise, their boots crunching on the frosted ground. A thin mist hung in the air, tinted orange by the distant glow of factory lights. The prisoners could hear the low hum of engines long before they saw the building itself. And when they finally stepped inside, the sight hit them like a wave. The factory was a living organism. Steam hissed, gears clanked, sparks rained from welding torches like showers of stars. The air was hot and metallic, filled with the rhythm of motion, the steady clang, clang, clang of hammers, the deep rumble of furnaces, the shouts of foremen echoing through the steel rafters. For a moment, even the most hardened among them forgot they were prisoners. Their eyes darted from machine to machine, watching the flow of production like children discovering something miraculous. Rows of women stood at the riveting stations, each one focused and precise. Their hair was tied up in scarves, their overalls streaked with grease, their hands moving faster than the prisoners thought humanly possible. They riveted wings to fuselages, welded plates to tank hulls, inspected bolts and gauges with eyes sharp as blades. No one was idle. No one hesitated. The tempo was perfect, as if the entire workforce shared a single heartbeat. One German prisoner, a former engineer named Helmut, watched in disbelief. "They work like soldiers," he muttered in his native tongue. His American guard overheard and smiled faintly. "They are soldiers," the guard said, "just not the kind you're used to." The more they observed, the more the prisoners understood that this was not chaos. It was coordination. There was discipline here, but it was not enforced by fear. It came from pride, from the knowledge that every bolt tightened, every plate welded, every crate shipped could mean a life saved at the front. The workers knew what they were building. They knew who would fly the planes and drive the tanks. And that knowledge gave their labor meaning that no whip, no speech, no propaganda could ever manufacture. At the lunch break, the Axis prisoners sat together in the corner, eating the sandwiches issued to them. They watched as the workers, men and women both, laughed, teased one another, and shared coffee in tin mugs. There was lightness in the air, even joy, though the work was grueling. It confused them. In Germany or Italy, factory labor had been a grim affair, driven by orders from above and the fear of punishment. Here, it seemed fueled by something invisible, something almost contagious belief. They soon learned that the plant never closed. When one shift ended, another began. The workers leaving at dusk passed the ones arriving at dawn like runners exchanging a torch. The Axis prisoners would often lie awake at night in their barracks, listening to the distant hum of the plant, the faint pulse of machinery that never stopped. It was as if the very earth beneath them vibrated with purpose. Over time, the prisoners were assigned to assist in small tasks, loading crates, sorting bolts, carrying steel sheets. Under watchful eyes, they worked alongside the Americans, moving through the same vast hangars, breathing the same hot air, feeling the same tremors from the presses and welders. And with each passing day, they grew quieter. They watched the women most of all. These were not delicate figures from propaganda posters. They were strong, confident, capable. They lifted heavy equipment, operated cranes, handled tools with practiced grace. Many of the POs had been raised in societies where women were expected to remain at home, silent and obedient. Yet here, they were the lifeblood of industry, and no one questioned it. Rosie the Riveter. The guards called them with a grin. The POWs began to use the name too, first mockingly, then with a kind of awe. Helmut often caught himself studying the factory floor, not with envy but with wonder. He couldn't help comparing it to his homeland. Back in Germany, his factory had been filled with fear. Workers whispering under their breath, supervisors shouting orders, Gestapo agents always nearby. Here, laughter mixed with the clang of machinery. It was not the sound of fear, it was the sound of purpose. They work for something real, he whispered once to another prisoner. Not for a man, for an idea. One afternoon, a storm rolled across the horizon, shaking the factory roof. Thunder roared, rain hammered against the windows, and lightning flashed across the sky. Yet the machines never stopped. The lights flickered, but the presses kept pounding, the welders kept sparking. The American workers barely noticed the storm. They simply worked through it, unbroken. The Axis prisoners stood in awe. Even nature seemed unable to interrupt the rhythm of this place. And then came the realization that shook them most of all. Despite the enormous output, the endless streams of tanks, planes, and vehicles, the people here were not starving. They were not exhausted or afraid. The nation was at war, yet its cities glowed, its people smiled, its shelves were full. How was such a thing possible? To them, war had always meant sacrifice in the most literal sense. Hunger, rationing, collapse. But in America, the factories fed themselves. Production wasn't just survival, it was prosperity. For the Japanese prisoners in another camp, the lesson was the same. They were taken to work near a shipyard on the Pacific coast, where the air smelled of salt and iron. There, they saw ships being born in front of their eyes. Destroyers, freighters, troop transports. The shipyard was a cathedral of steel, its cranes moving like colossal arms, its workers ant-like in number but divine in precision. Entire vessels that would have taken years to build in Japan were completed in months, sometimes weeks. It was, as one prisoner murmured, as if the sea itself obeyed them. One Italian POW named Vittorio was assigned to sweep near the welding bays. He often paused, mesmerized by the blue-white arcs of flame. "They build faster than we can fight," he said one evening, shaking his head. The American foreman heard him, looked up, and said quietly, "That's the point." The POWs soon realized that the Americans didn't just make things, they made makers. They trained new workers every day, taught them skills, handed them tools, and trusted them to learn. In Germany or Japan, such responsibility was reserved for the elite, the specialists. Here, anyone willing to work could master the craft. The idea that every man and woman mattered equally in the machinery of production was foreign, almost revolutionary to them. And yet it worked. The assembly lines rolled on faster and faster. Planes emerged like clockwork. Tanks rolled out gleaming and ready. Shells were packed by the thousands. The POWs began to understand that this wasn't merely industry. It was democracy in motion. Every worker's effort mattered. Every citizen's hand contributed to victory. At night, as the Axis prisoners were marched back to camp, the streets still glowed with light. Even small workshops stayed open, filled with the hum of late-night repairs and the murmur of radio music. In one shop window, a sign read, "We'll work till they come home." The POWs stared at it as they passed. No officer had ordered it. No government decree had demanded it. It was voluntary, a promise made by people who believed their effort could end the war faster. That idea, simple yet immense, lingered in the minds of the captives long after they returned to their bunks. Some of them began to change inwardly. The arrogance that had once defined them began to soften. They still carried pride for their homeland, but they also carried respect for this unseen, tireless army of workers who fought without guns or medals. They saw unity where they had been taught to see weakness. They saw creativity where they had been told there was chaos, and slowly admiration grew. A few even started to emulate what they saw. They began organizing their work crews more efficiently, cleaning tools after use, building makeshift racks and shelves in the camp workshop. It was small, perhaps meaningless to the guards, but to the prisoners, it was a quiet acknowledgement. They had learned something from the people they had once called enemies. Months passed, seasons changed. The war raged on, but inside the factories of America, the rhythm never faltered. The prisoners continued to witness a spectacle of endurance unlike anything they had known. When they read newspaper headlines, Allied victories in Italy, the invasion of France, they no longer doubted how those victories were won. They understood now that for every soldier on the front, there were 1,000 workers behind him, forging his armor, building his lifeline. Helmut once said to another German prisoner, "If we had half their spirit, we might have changed the world too." The other man only nodded, staring through the factory fence at the lights that shimmered like stars over the assembly yard. By the time the war neared its end, many Axis POs carried within them a quiet, lasting respect for what they had seen. They would never forget the roar of the presses, the rhythm of the shifts, the women with sparks in their hair and resolve in their eyes. They had witnessed the invisible army, the real one, that made the impossible possible. It wasn't brute force or blind loyalty that had built America's war machine. It was belief, unity, and an unyielding sense of purpose. The POWs had come as prisoners of war, but in those endless factories, surrounded by light, motion, and human willpower, they became something else. Witnesses to the power of a free people who had turned labor itself into victory. Time passed differently for the Axis prisoners in America. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The clang of machinery that once startled them became as familiar as the ticking of a clock. Yet beneath the routine of labor, a quiet transformation was taking place, one not of the body, but of the spirit. At first, they had looked upon their captors with defiance. They had been trained to see Americans as weak, spoiled, and undisciplined. But every passing day challenged that illusion, until the last fragments of it fell away like dust in sunlight. By the final year of the war, most of them had worked in or near America's vast industrial network. They had seen the factories, the shipyards, the airfields, each an engine in a machine that stretched from one coast to the other. And now, as they rested behind barbed wire fences in the cool evenings, they began to understand something far deeper than production or power. They began to see the moral force behind it all, the invisible current that drove an entire people to build, to create, to sustain life even amid the destruction of war. To their surprise, they found kindness where they expected cruelty. The guards were firm but fair. Meals were regular, even generous compared to what many of them had eaten before capture. They were given books, music, and even classes. Some were allowed to work on farms, others in lumber mills or workshops. There were rules, yes, and discipline, but there was also dignity. No one beat them. No one starved them. Their labor was paid in small wages, their opinions tolerated, their humanity acknowledged. It was not the treatment of enemies, it was the treatment of men. For those who had lived under the iron regimes of Berlin, Rome, or Tokyo, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Back home, obedience had been extracted through fear. Here, it was earned through respect. They saw how the Americans worked together, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in something larger than themselves. This realization came slowly, often in quiet, personal moments. A guard sharing a cigarette, A farmer offering water on a hot day, a worker pausing to show them how to operate a tool without anger or condescension. In one camp, located near the rolling fields of Kansas, a group of German prisoners helped repair agricultural equipment. They expected resentment from the farmers whose sons were fighting overseas. Instead, they found patience. An old farmer named Tom, his hands rough and calloused from decades of work, often spoke with them during breaks. His German was broken, learned from his immigrant grandparents, but his meaning was clear enough. Work is work, he would say, smiling faintly. You fix the land? The land feeds us all. Those words lingered in the minds of the prisoners. It was such a simple truth, yet it carried a moral weight they couldn't ignore. Here, even in war, Americans built things meant to last: bridges, barns, factories, farms. They didn't destroy for destruction's sake. They created to sustain. And slowly, the POWs began to see the pattern. The same principle guided everything. From how the factories ran to how the people treated their captives. America's power wasn't born merely from machines. It was born from a sense of purpose grounded in decency. Many nights, the prisoners sat outside their barracks after roll call, staring at the glowing horizon where the city lights mingled with the stars. The sound of distant trains rumbled like a pulse through the dark. For the first time, some of them allowed themselves to think beyond the war, beyond orders and ideology. They wondered what kind of country could fight with such force yet treat its enemies with such fairness. A few of them wrote letters home describing their experiences, careful to avoid censorship but unable to hide their awe. They do not hate us, one wrote. They build, they work, they move as one. It is strange, it is humbling. Among the prisoners were officers, engineers, craftsmen, and young men barely old enough to shave. Each of them had carried the burden of propaganda, the belief that their nations represented the pinnacle of civilization. But in the stillness of those American nights, surrounded by order, kindness, and overwhelming productivity, they began to question everything they had been taught. For some, the realization was painful. Pride battled with conscience. Others accepted it quietly, even gratefully. They had seen the truth, and the truth was liberating. At one camp in Texas, a Japanese naval officer named Sato spent his days working in a machine shop repairing tractors. The guards noticed his precision. Every bolt tightened, every part perfectly aligned. One afternoon, as he worked beside an older American mechanic named Walter, he spoke in halting English. "You treat prisoners with honor," he said softly, "even with the enemy." Walter shrugged and replied, "War's the fight. Humanity's the rule." Sato never forgot those words. Years later, after returning to Japan, he would tell his students that the strength of a nation lies not in how it conquers, but in how it forgives. It was this quiet humanity that changed the POWs more than anything else. They realized that America's power wasn't merely industrial. It was moral, a strength built on values of fairness, cooperation, and hope. The same principles that built tanks and ships also built trust and compassion. It was all part of the same engine. The more they saw, the more they respected it. Some began helping the guards voluntarily, organizing the barracks, teaching each other English, even repairing camp equipment. These small gestures weren't acts of submission. They were acts of understanding. When news of the war's end finally came, it spread through the camps like a shockwave. The prisoners gathered by the fences, listening to the guards' radios, hearing the words they had dreamed of and feared. All at once Germany had surrendered. Japan was on the brink. There was no cheering, no celebration, only silence. For many of them, it felt as though the world they had known had dissolved. They thought of their families, their cities in ruins, their leaders gone. But amid that grief, a strange sense of clarity also emerged. They knew who had truly won the war. And it wasn't just the soldiers. It was the men and women in the factories, the farmers, the builders, the thinkers, the ordinary citizens who had turned belief into strength. The prisoners realized that America's might came not from domination, but from conviction. The factories had not been monuments to greed, they were temples of purpose. And in witnessing that, even as captives, the Axis soldiers found a measure of peace. Many of them would later tell their children and grandchildren about what they saw. The vastness of the assembly lines, the fairness of their captors, the dignity of American work. They spoke not with bitterness, but with reverence. In post-war Germany and Italy, a few former POWs became advocates for rebuilding their nations with similar ideals: democracy, cooperation, fairness. They carried pieces of America within them, not the physical America of machines and steel, but the moral one that had treated them as men when the world called them enemies. For others, the memories were quieter, but no less profound. They would close their eyes and remember the glow of a sunset over a factory roof, the scent of oil and grass mixed in the evening breeze, the murmur of distant trains. They would remember the guard who offered a cigarette, the worker who showed them kindness, the farmer who shared his bread. Those small acts of decency had done what no bullet could. They had changed hearts. Even decades later, historians interviewing former POWs often found the same refrain. "We respected them," one said. "Not because they won, but because of how they won." Another remembered standing outside the factory fence, watching as a convoy of newly built trucks rolled past, each painted with a white star. "That star," he said, "came to mean something different to us. It meant work. It meant hope." As peace settled over the world and the prisoners were repatriated, many felt an ache they couldn't quite explain. America had been their captor, yet it had also become their teacher. They had entered its camps as soldiers of fallen empires and left as witnesses to a new kind of power. A power not of conquest, but of conviction. When they returned home, they found cities in ruins, families shattered, governments broken. Yet somewhere inside, they carried a spark, a memory of what they had seen and felt. Some helped rebuild their countries with that memory in mind, pushing for fairer systems, better treatment of workers, and more open societies. They had seen what unity could achieve, what freedom could build. They understood that true strength lay not in oppression, but in opportunity. Years later, one former German POW who had spent his captivity in Illinois stood before a classroom of students in a rebuilt Berlin. He held up an old photograph of the American factory where he had once labored as a prisoner. "This," he told them, "was where I first understood what makes a nation strong. Not fear, not hate, but this, the will to build when others destroy, to give when others take, to believe when others despair." His students listened in silence. Few could imagine the world he had seen, the war he had lived through, but the lesson remained. The story of the Axis POWs in America was not just one of captivity. It was a story of revelation, of men who entered the heart of the enemy and found humanity, discipline, and purpose where they expected arrogance and brutality. The barbed wire that once confined them became a window through which they saw the true nature of power. They had glimpsed the spirit that turned factories into fortresses, workers into warriors, and ideals into victories. And though they left America behind, it never truly left them. It lingered in their memories like the echo of a great machine, the hum of freedom itself.